Hello and welcome to Talk the Walk. I'm Azam Khan. In the recent budget speech, the Hong Kong government announced tobacco duty effective immediately, with tax now accounting for 68% of the price of a pack of cigarettes. The goal of this is to help people kick the habit and deter young people from starting. They said the target is to bring the smoking rate in the city from the current 9.5% to about 7.8%. How significant is the move, and what more needs to be done in public policy in safeguarding public health? Joining me to discuss the topic is Hong Kong-based medical doctor and international tobacco control advocate, Dr. Judith Mackay. She's a senior advisor to the World Health Organization and director of the Asian Consultancy on Tobacco Control. Dr. Mackay, thank you so much for taking the time.
You're welcome.
Obviously, the biggest news this week is the dropping of the mask mandate. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. And I feel like people in the city are still going to be wearing it, but a number of people also are breathing a sigh of relief.
I think it shifts responsibility from the government onto the people themselves, and I think it had to come. It was about time, and I think it was done just at about the right point after the winter, when there's more COVID and there's more flu. So I would applaud the move. And I think, as you said, many people will have a hybrid existence, wearing it on public transport, but certainly going out into the countryside or in the streets not wearing it, and I think that's fine. That's comparable with what's happening with the rest of the world. But I have to say, you know, no country's got this epidemic right. Every country struggled with the right thing to do, to shut down, to open up, to the vaccination programs. It's been almost like trying to fly an aeroplane while you're actually building it. And I think for that reason, World Health Organization is actually negotiating at this moment a pandemic treaty, so that there's going to be some order brought into the next one, and there will be a next one for sure. There has been throughout history.
Right. Obviously, in the recent budget speech, the government announced the tobacco duty, and who better to ask than you on this? So what were your reactions to that initially?
I was really happy. You know, most people think with tobacco control that if you do health education in schools, if you have some smoke-free areas, if you ban the advertising, these are the main things to do. And actually, they're not. The surprising thing is that it's a fiscal policy. It's raising tax, which is what brings down smoking amongst young people, because they can't afford it. It's as simple as that. If you raise the price of cigarettes, the young people can't afford to buy it. And if you can nudge young people to the age of about 22 or 23, that's when the frontal lobes in their brain mature. That's when they start making long-term decisions in their long-term best interest. So if you can get them to the age of about 23, then they don't start smoking. But I do note that the average age of starting to smoke around the world is under 20. So as I said, that fiscal policy is really spot on. We haven't had an increase for quite some time.
Roughly 10 years, I believe, right?
Almost 10 years. I've been badgering the financial secretary year after year after year after year. So it's timely, it's still not enough, and it doesn't lay down any future program. I mean, I spend 3 months of my life every year negotiating the budget with the financial secretary, with the Council of Smoking and Health, with Clear the Air, trying to put in submissions for it. We need an orderly plan of action, and at minimum, we should have an increase consistent with the cost of living.
Right. And so how would you compare, is it an effective move in the sense that, and how would you compare it to the price of cigarettes in other parts of the world? And has there been a parallel, has there been a decline in smoking from that policy in Australia or in the US?
Oh, absolutely. This is what brings the prevalence of smoking down. And in terms of the rest of the world, Singapore, of course, is way ahead of us and Australia, but we're not doing badly. But WHO has said it should be 75% tax, should be 75% of the sales price. And we're up, as you said, just to the late 60s at the moment. So we have more to do and further to go. But, you know, our government is always very cautious, and rightly so in many an occasion. So I'll be back next year lobbying again for them to basically put it up. And just one thing, what will the tobacco industry say? The tobacco industry say every year that if you put up the price of cigarettes, if you put up the tax, then you will get more smuggling. And this is completely untrue. Our own Director of Customs has said there is no correlation between putting up the tax and smuggling.
And the black market being...
And the black market. No, I mean, smuggling goes backwards and forwards over borders, many times over the same border. It's unrelated to how much you put up.
It would go on regardless, you're saying?
It'll go on regardless, and I have to say that the master hand behind the smuggling is actually the tobacco companies themselves. They smuggle their own cigarettes, and they do so to avoid the price component. So in other words, they've got cheap cigarettes. They can flood the markets with cheap cigarettes. They don't have to put on the pack warnings. They don't have to abide by many of the regulations that we have on legally selling cigarettes. So the tobacco industry will cry out loud every year, they'll scream every year that putting up the tax will lead to a great increase in illicit trade, and it does not.
Right. But with this milestone now reached with the taxing, what would be the next steps? What would you like to see? You said you want to continue further. There's more to do. Can you give some examples of what that would look like, what that would entail?
There's more to do with taxation,
Okay.
That's for sure.
Specifically with
That's
taxation.
every year. There's more to do with taxation and to maintain that and increase that. Other areas, we've done pretty well in Hong Kong. We've got pack warnings that are 85% of the pack. We've got smoke-free areas in most indoor areas. We've pretty much banned advertising. I remember in the 80s and 90s, a program like this, every single advertising break would be a tobacco advertisement. Tennis would be sponsored, the Salem tennis competition, they'd all be sponsored by the tobacco industry. We've actually done pretty well, and getting our prevalence down at this very moment to 9.6 is amazing, to go into single figures where only a handful of countries have done that in the world.
Oh, really? Only a handful?
Yes, only a handful. So we're right up there in doing the right things and getting them done. But there's always things to do. I mean, these e-cigarettes are an example of that. You know, suddenly out of the blue comes a new challenge.
Right, that's a new frontier now.
A new frontier. And the tobacco industry are very skillful in just always finding a way around the regulations that we try to put in place and increase their sales and profits.
Right. So you mentioned e-cigarettes, and that's banned in Hong Kong. But there's surveys that say that even with that banning, that it doesn't maybe not necessarily deter, like people will still go back to smoking cigarettes if they were using e-cigarette. If they were using the e-cigarette, they'll go back to normal smoking. Or they would try and find in the black market. So what do you say to that?
There's so many things to say about e-cigarettes. I think the whole thing was put off track at the very beginning by Public Health England, saying that e-cigarettes were 95% safer than ordinary cigarettes. And many people, many governments bought into that assumption and therefore thought we should almost promote them. And 3 countries have done that. England, not Scotland, I'm glad to say, but England, New Zealand and America. They are pushing e-cigarettes, and they're pushing them as a substitute for adult smoking. Now, what we now know, 10 years on, 15 years on, is that that doesn't work. You will always find somebody whose auntie used an e-cigarette and quit smoking, but in population terms, they do not work at all. At best, they dual use, using half and half with conventional cigarettes. We also now know that they are a gateway for young people. Stanford University have shown that young people who smoke are much more likely to go on, who vape, are much more likely to go on and smoke conventional cigarettes. They've shown that in Taiwan as well, 3 times more. That's what WHO says. In other words, it's a gateway for young people. And what Public Health England didn't take into account at all was the social science. They looked just at a very narrow toxicology range, not even looking at all the ingredients. But the more and more evidence is coming out that these are not a safe alternative to smoking. And so I think it's really important for people to understand that. And I think the Hong Kong government made the right decision. I have to say, in the face of bitter opposition from the tobacco industry, a veteran legislator said to me that they had never seen in LegCo, ever, the amount of lobbying and pressure that was put on the legislators regarding the ban on e-cigarettes and anything, not just on smoking, not even just on Hill, but anything. They had the lawyers in, the public relations people, and I've just written, co-authored a pamphlet with Sophia Chan, who was then the Secretary for Health. And I mean, she herself says that there was completely inappropriate pressure and threatening and harassment put on the government to try and stop this ban going through.
How would you compare the impact on public policy by the tobacco industry locally in Hong Kong and globally? Is there a similar, basically it's a similar dynamic?
It is. The tobacco industry's strategy and tactics are pretty much the same around the world. And initially, 30, 40 years ago, it was denial of the health evidence. And they certainly did that in Hong Kong. For example, they claimed that environmental tobacco smoke. Second-hand smoke wasn't harmful, and we now know, of course, it is. So they've tried to deny the evidence, they've tried to challenge the economic evidence. When we tried to ban smoking in indoor areas in Hong Kong, restaurants, for example, they said, oh, there'd be thousands out of work, the restaurants would lose money, etc., etc. And I did a very simple thing. I contacted the tax department here, and I said, can you give me the tax return of the restaurants just before the ban and 2 years later? Did it go down? No, it did not. It went up 31%. The restaurants benefited from putting a ban, so they try to challenge the economic evidence. And more they threaten legislation, not just trade threats, but legislation as well. They have legal threats against governments who try and introduce any tobacco control measure that works. So we're not alone in this. But I think Hong Kong, having done this, we immediately exported the fact, look, we've banned it in Hong Kong, you can do it. We've got a target to we're down in single figures, we do not need e-cigarettes to bring our smoking rates down. So we are very active in exporting this idea to other countries in the world. And of course, the tobacco industry don't like that at all.
So did you like hearing it in the budget as well? He said that he wanted to reduce it to 7.8%, the smoking rate. That would be, where would that fall in the global, roughly in the global average?
That's a global recommendation by World Health Organization for all countries in the world. It's quite a compulated formula, a certain percentage compared with 2010, compared with the present smoking rates, and ours is, as you say, in the 7%. And so we're, in a sense, under an international obligation to get there, and we cannot do it without the tax going up. I think we made this quite clear to the Financial Secretary this time. But, he's done the right thing in this budget. I think it's a bit late. It could have come much sooner, but at least we're making steps forward with that.
I'm going to have to pause you right there, Dr. Mackay, while we take a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Dr. Judith Mackay. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Talk the Walk. I'm speaking with Dr. Judith Mackay, Senior Advisor to the World Health Organization. Doctor, the rate of smoking has gone down globally over the years, in Hong Kong as well. So would you say the battle's been won?
We're down now, a global figure is 18%. 18% of adults in the world smoke. And it's important to know that because it means smokers everywhere are in a minority. So when we're talking, for example, about the right to smoke or the right to clean air, we have to remember that 4/5 of adults don't smoke, and if you add children in, it's even more than that. So the rights of the non-smoker surely predominate over the rights of the smoker. Yes, the percentage has gone down, but the problem is the world population is growing. So even if we bring the percentage down, there are more smokers.
Correct me if I'm wrong, New Zealand was one of the first countries to introduce this sweeping tobacco law where they banned the sale of tobacco to the younger generation to prevent the future generation from smoking. Is that something that you could see happening elsewhere in the world?
New Zealand is banning the sale of tobacco to everybody born after a certain year. But just to sort of go back a few decades, in fact, the first country in the world to do anything on tobacco by national law was Singapore in 1970. Everybody thinks it was Norway, but in 1973 it was Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew apparently went to London and somebody told him, smoking isn't very good for you. So in true Singaporean style, he went back, they had a ban on advertising, they created smoke-free areas. They set the world off in the direction of looking at public health policy on tobacco. More recently, the New Zealand government have introduced this idea that nobody born after a certain year. Several countries are looking at this because that means that there's a generation who will grow up and never smoke in the future. And I think when you asked me earlier, what more do you want? What more can you do? We're forever looking at not just strengthening the things we know that work, but also trying to find some new ideas.
I understand you're still recovering from a long aftermath of COVID.
I am.
And that's something which I've heard many people experiencing. So could you just share your thoughts on that?
Yes, I caught COVID in Edinburgh in Scotland in August last year, which is now nearly 8 months ago. And I was a bit poorly at the time, but since then I have really suffered from long COVID. I've got breathlessness, climbing upstairs, or even walking up a slight incline, and even walking for any length of time. I'm very fatigued. I've got a lot of muscle sort of weakness. Now, today, for example, I went to my Tai Chi class this morning, and now I'm coming here in the afternoon to do this interview. I could not do that without going to bed to sleep for 2 or 3 hours, 2 hours in between these two. This is so unlike me. You know, I'm an 18-hole golfer. I do Tai Chi. I work full time. But people look at me and they say, but, you know, you look all right. But that's where my lung scan came in. The doctors at Queen Elizabeth did a lung scan, and it was awful. It showed bits of my lung had collapsed. I got a lot of sort of inflammatory nodules. I've got lots of scarring. And my husband said to me, you know, do you feel better or worse having had the lung scan? I said, actually, I feel better because it validates what I've been saying. The truth is, I'm no better than I was 8 months ago. And looking at all the recent literature, people who get long COVID like me, you know, Chung Sang-gun, the long COVID, people who get the long COVID like me, it goes on for years. And what I don't know is, am I going to be better tomorrow? Or am I not going to be ever better? Or am I just going to be like this for the rest of my life? I don't know that.
So do you think there's a lot more now to be uncovered in terms of the aftermath, the effects of everything? Is that now that the restrictions are dropped and behind us, is it more of a focus on the understanding of now what the long-term effects are?
There certainly needs to be in Hong Kong. I mean, we didn't really have COVID until about this time last year, when we had that very big epidemic with people, you know, on trolleys in the hospital grounds and car parks and things. That's when we had almost our really only big wave. So we've got very little experience of it here, and there is no one-stop clinic. There's nowhere to go. I have had to be almost like the conductor of my own orchestra, trying to find out, oh yes, they've got a COVID clinic at Chinese University. Yes, perhaps go to traditional Chinese medicine and acupuncture. I've had to orchestrate it and find it all myself. And if I, as a long-term doctor living in Hong Kong, had such difficulties tracking down where to go and what to do, I can't imagine what it must be like for the average person who has symptoms. And I think they say that, you know, at minimum, you know, 10 to 20% of people who get COVID get this long COVID. We need to have much more acute facilities, much better facilities for people who've got long COVID. And I've talked to the government about this, but the difficulty is that because there's about 80 different symptoms with long COVID,
it's very open-ended.
They said, you know, everybody would just I said, well, you can get primary or secondary referral from doctors only and accept patients in that respect to come, to cut down on everybody with a bit of an ache and pain walking. It's not impossible, and other countries are doing it. They've got long COVID clinics. And I think they're only now beginning to look at treatment. That's the other thing. There's 3 theories about long COVID. One is it's viral fragments, not infectious, but viral fragments that stay with you. The second one is that it's an immunological disorder. You're getting a hyperimmune reaction sort of to the virus. And the other third theory is that it's to do with microcoagulation and blocking up, you know, bits of your arteries and things like that. So, I mean, there should be treatments coming available, and there's lots of trials on at the moment.
From the recent budget, the government has earmarked a lot of money, not just into the traditional Chinese medicine research to help build the facility over here, about $500 million, and then billions of dollars into the tech and innovation in science, but also the medical field as well. So will this only further enhance, when you combine that with Hong Kong having a renowned medical research at the tertiary level, is this a way for Hong Kong to become more of a healthcare hub?
I think it already is. I think certainly in terms of traditional medicine and acupuncture, when Margaret Chan was the Director of Health some 20 years ago now, she really brought in the idea of looking at traditional Chinese medicine, looking at the medicines themselves and looking at the practitioners and standardizing and regulating what was going on. Because in the early days, much traditional Chinese medicine, it was loaded with steroids and aspirin. I mean, it was really quite dangerous. It was completely untested, unregulated. Yes, it had a 5,000-year history, and some people would argue that's comparable to doing studies on drugs like we do with Western medicine. But Margaret really brought it, and now there are sort of qualifications that you have to sit if you want to become. So Hong Kong has pioneered this. There's nowhere else really in the world, perhaps apart from China, that is really actually regulating and promoting traditional medicine alongside Western medicine as well. So it's not just with COVID, this is happening in general.
The one part of the budget which they felt that the government is perhaps like overlooked, and the blueprint, the healthcare blueprint that was released late last year, was the lack of focus on mental health. Would you say that's true? And what are ways that the government or in public policy in general can help tackle the issue?
I'm not an expert in mental health, but it has been a neglected specialty. And again, there's often not exactly not much to show for it. You see a person who may be severely depressed, and yet they might look quite normal. So it's really quite difficult. But they do say that COVID has sort of heightened and exposed the mental health problems of isolation and wearing masks and not going to school amongst children in particular. So I think it's very timely again that this is really being looked into in Hong Kong. Hong Kong hasn't done badly on mental health, but I think, again, just like smoking, we need to do more.
You split your time between Hong Kong and the UK. So what was it like when you were there recently? Last summer, I believe you were in the UK. What was the impression of Hong Kong and the impression of China, whether it's to do with COVID or otherwise?
Well, otherwise, I think is probably the one that's, in a sense, the most important. I mean, every single day we were in the UK, which was for 3 months, we went back to see the family. Every single day, people said, we're astonished we were coming back voluntarily of our own decision. We were coming back to a repressive, brutal communist regime where there was no freedom of speech and, there was police brutality. This was so widespread in England and in Scotland that I spent the 3 months defending Hong Kong and indeed China, but certainly defending Hong Kong, to say, yes, every government has its problems, of course they do, but, and in a sense almost promoting Hong Kong. I think I was a very good ambassador in trying to put to bed some of the myths that are going on.
It's quite binary, the impression that they have over there. And I guess it's all to do with lack of information, right?
Well, it's not just lack of information, it's the information that is completely wrong. And as I said, I mean, Hong Kong just isn't like that. And for example, when I was in the taxi driving to Heathrow, the taxi driver, who turned out to be an ex-policeman, said to me, but, which terminal? I said, well, we're travelling on Cathay Pacific, trying to support local industry and everything. And he said, you're not going back to... He was startled, he almost stopped his cab. He said, you're not going back to Hong Kong. And I said, yes, that's where I live. And he said, but how can you? He said, it's dangerous. I mean, and he said, the police kill people. And I said, well, we had some demonstrations in 2019. I said, you tell me. I said, how many people did the police kill? How many? And he said, well, I think hundreds. And I said, they didn't kill one, not a single one that we had in our demonstrations here in 2019. And I said, at the very same time in France, there were some demonstrations, probably so they could all retire at 50 or 60 or something. They had some demonstrations and the police shot 14 or 15 of them. I said, we didn't have one. I said, I'm safe in Hong Kong. I can go to any car park in Hong Kong at midnight and collect my car. As a woman, on my own, midnight, collect my car, and I'm safe. I said, there's not many cities in the world you can do that. So I spent my entire summer, firstly, battling COVID in the latter half, but secondly, just trying to get across the idea that really Hong Kong was a very viable place. It was not as is being portrayed. And whether we've got caught up with the anti-China sentiment, which was also terribly strong in parts of the world. And as I said, I work in tobacco control. I work with kings, I work with communists, I work with democracies. These governments are all comparable to me in many ways. They're certainly comparable in smoking and what needs to be done. And I work with all of them, and I just don't get involved with that kind of politics.
Dr. Judith Mackay, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again same time next week. Goodbye.